back to my channel. It's Christina from Our Wood Home. Today's video is kind of a continuation of last week's video in which I talked about how to start a garden. This one is more about what you should plant in your vegetable garden. Keep in mind, these are just my personal tips, things that I've considered when figuring out my vegetable garden. I'm going to be looking down every so often because I've got my notes on my iPad here. In my previous video, I talked a little bit about knowing your gardening zone or hardiness zone. I think it's really important to know what grows in your specific zone. I'm going to use the example of watermelon because it's something that I'm familiar with. Watermelon doesn't typically grow very well in my zone of 5B unless it's in a greenhouse or it's otherwise babied and taken care of. I can grow it here outside in the ground, but I need to start the seeds indoors well in advance of transplanting outside. And I have to make sure they are hardened off before putting them in the ground. And then I need to keep the plant warm and moist. To do so, I typically have to water it quite often and then keep the seedling covered with some type of clear cover to create a mini greenhouse. This is just more work than I want to put into watermelons, so I choose not to grow them here, but it can be done. Another example is tomatoes. They won't thrive here if I just put the seeds directly in the ground after the risk of frost has passed. Typically, that could be the end of May to the beginning of June. We sometimes still get snow in May and June. Our growing season is way too short for tomatoes, so if I just put the seeds in the soil directly, the plant's still going to grow and it might get some little tomatoes on it, but it's not going to be mature before the next frost hits. To summarize, know your garden zone so you can take into account any special requirements of vegetables that you choose to grow. The next tip I have is to keep in mind the space that you have. Some plants require a lot of room to spread, such as pumpkins, while others can be a little bit crowded and do perfectly fine, such as lettuce. Similarly, there's some plants that do best on a vertical trellis. Pumpkins are heavy, so I guess they could go up a vertical trellis, but it's not likely that you could have something that's strong enough to support the pumpkin unless it's a little miniature variety. So therefore you would need a lot of space along the ground for your pumpkins to grow. But there are many smaller squash varieties that can grow vertically very well. Let's say, for example, you're starting with a 50 square foot garden. You can still plant a lot of things in that space. But I suggest utilizing vertical space as well as ground space. In this example, you might be able to fit several tomato plants, some climbing beans on a trellis, root crops such as beets, and even a few cabbage and lettuce plants. My next tip is to grow what you eat. That might sound obvious, but I'm going to say it anyways. Start by growing what you and your family typically eat in terms of vegetables. It can definitely be fun to try growing some new things that you've never had before. And I'm all in favor of doing that, but just in small quantities. For example, if your family has never tried beets before, start by planting a dozen seeds because each seed is going to yield one beet. If beets are a hit and everybody loves them, you can plant more next year. If they didn't go over very well, you didn't waste a ton of space growing them. Think about what vegetables you typically buy and try growing them. My stepmom did a garden for the first time last year, and her main priorities were tomatoes, cucumbers, and lettuce because these are foods that her household typically enjoys when they purchase from the grocery store. My next tip is to be mindful of the sunlight. I touched on this in my previous video, but I'll say it again. Be mindful of how much sun exposure your garden is going to get. If your garden is in a shady spot, A lot of things like tomatoes, for example, are not going to do very well there because they need a lot of sun exposure to grow. Instead, consider things like cabbage, broccoli, root vegetables, or leafy greens because these can all thrive in shady spots. My last tip to share is to research the yields before planting. A single acorn squash plant can yield between 2 to 8 squash. Each one can weigh up to 3 pounds, which means you could potentially harvest up to 24 pounds of squash from a single plant. Keep the yields in mind when sowing your seeds so you don't end up with more than you can or want to eat. Of course, it's wise to sow more than one seed, just in case, but be prepared to either have high yields if all those seeds germinate, or be prepared to pull out the plant before it flowers if you don't want that much of the certain plant. Most seed packages that I've seen give a yield estimate. For example, it will say each plant produces X number of fruits weighing however much per fruit. But if you're in doubt or if your package doesn't have that, you can just do a quick internet search to see the yields for anything that you want to grow. If you have the space in your garden and the desire for high yields from your vegetables, be prepared for how you will cook or preserve them. You don't want to be sitting with 20 pounds of squash, 15 pounds of tomatoes, and several dozen zucchini all at the end of summer and trying to figure out what to do with all of them before they spoil. Those are all the tips I wanted to share for choosing what to plant in your vegetable garden. I hope that you found this interesting and informative, and if you haven't already, I suggest you check out my previous video on how to start a garden. If you like what you see here on my channel, I hope that you consider subscribing. Again, thank you so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.